Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by one of Twitter's most prolific bibliophiles, Irkutyanin. We're going to call him Irk because I'm having some trouble pronouncing it. It's a Russian name. You know, he's not a Russian agent. I've checked. He's not working with the FSB. But Irk, how are you doing?
I am doing great, Scott. I am happy to be on here, and we have a couple of topics here today. I'm glad that you've also said my entire name, Irkutyanin. It's great.
Irkutyanin. Yeah, I got it close enough. You know, stupid American trying to pronounce different names on here. It's happened with some other foreign guests as well, but hopefully we won't have many of those troubles today. And Irk is one of the most well-read people on Twitter. This guy has read many old books. If the slogan "read old books," this guy has decided to read all of them. So today we're going to talk about Woodrow Wilson. Irk has read at least three different biographies about Woodrow Wilson, and has read most of his original work. So I brought him on to discuss this topic. Woodrow, of course, is being canceled right now. Even though he was once beloved by liberals, now they got to get rid of him. Princeton's highly respected, as Donald Trump called it, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs recently decided to drop Wilson's name because he's now too racist to be honored. Conservatives cheered the decision because they see Wilson as the ultimate racist, big government Democrat. Irk, what do you make of Wilson's cancellation? Why do liberals no longer like Wilson?
Well, on surface level, it really doesn't make sense because the fundamental basis of American power and position abroad is predicated, originally from this sort of moral vision of what Wilson saw America's role as being. But you have to also keep in mind that he is someone from, the 19th century. And so you can anachronistically, put current morality of race onto Woodrow Wilson, and you can just cancel him because it's not really important who you cancel or why you're canceling them. It's just important that Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and we're superior to Woodrow Wilson now. We're the higher form of liberalism. So in terms of that, Woodrow Wilson's cancellation, it's just you have a very mixed legacy of Woodrow Wilson, both domestically and foreign. And dealing with that legacy is something that current historians just don't want to do. So it's easier to just condemn and move on, really, if you're a part of these institutions of power and narrative setting.
Yeah, and Wilson turned Princeton from as they like to say, a genteel country club into one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, even though it was, of course, already a well-respected institution at the time. I believe James Madison and of other great Americans had attended Princeton years before Wilson had even been born. So it already had a big reputation at that time. But Wilson, as president of the university, turned it into what it is today. Not necessarily if that's good. I think one thing on the right is that we shouldn't necessarily cry over these institutions eating themselves. Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all these elite institutions are helping to build this really, the global homo empire, and support all these terrible ideas. And most of the people who are there support Black Lives Matter, and they just want to get in government and to enact a far left agenda. So it makes sense that they don't want somebody who had nice things to say, or rather had ideas about race that are no longer acceptable in 21st century discourse at all, unless you want to be an anonymous Twitter user. What he said about race, Reconstruction, and we'll get that into that moment, is definitely something that doesn't go along with his image that was popularized in 10 to 15 years ago. If you remember, during the Obama era, a lot of people were like, oh, Obama will be another Wilson, even though They favored FDR is, of course, at that time was their number one hero, and Wilson was a close second. But they were all saying like, "Oh, we need another Wilson." And even in the Bush era, liberals were salivating over Wilson as somebody who supported the idea of a big government, that it needs to create all these benefits for the people, it needs to take care of its people, and it needs to actively be involved against evil corporations. And even though those ideas aren't as, the kind of cringe liberalism of Occupy Democrats, which were definitely these people who were having hagiography of FDR and Wilson, that's not necessarily what is in style right now. I mean, it's something very different. It's not necessarily that this is even the kind of anti-corporate thrust of 10 to 15 years ago isn't there, because all the corporations are supporting their decisions. There is some things about evil rich people, but it's more about their race than their income.
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter that he went after big corporate interests.
Right. And I mean, the ultimate irony of it is, there's a lot of, Princeton's counted amongst, these Ivy League elite institutions, and it has this huge barrier of entry for, almost every American to actually go there. And it wouldn't really be that way. There's plenty of colonial era seminaries or universities that sprang up around the same time that we've completely lost, like Androvo Theological Seminary, right? Like that completely shut down. It was like a part of the conservative, theologically speaking, split off from Harvard. And it's gone now, right? Like it's an institution that's gone. So, Wilson's own legacy at Princeton, just by erasing that, you've basically erased the legacy of that college, right? And I mean that's actually a good thing to have these colleges eliminate their own sort of reason for existing, or like their standing, their continuity. We should actually be applauding that when they just go after and destroy themselves. But again, like there's obviously going to be, I don't get on the cancel Yale club because I think that's a waste of energy. But still, there is something to be celebrated there because it's very delegitimizing. And of course, with COVID, we've seen this push for transfer to online. But as far as Obama and being the new Wilson, that's actually, and we'll get to this, that's probably a little bit more apt in ways that they don't really recognize, because as Wilson gets put into the World War and the February Revolution occurs in Russia, that creates an entire destabilization for 10 years, roughly 10 years of civil war inside of Russia itself. And with the Arab Spring, that's actually a pretty good parallel, having this idealistic and then the cynical underbelly of pushed politics, and then destabilizing the entire region. That is probably good, but we'll probably get to that later when we talk about the foreign policy implications of Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons that a lot of people on the dissident right don't like him, is because of his foreign policy stance. Even though, I'll go into that. Is that one of the main reasons the dissident right doesn't like him is that they complain that he got us into World War I and that he's somehow responsible for the Treaty of Versailles. Yet, if they really look at the history, is that Republicans at that time were like very demanding we get into World War I. They're far more bloodthirsty about it than than Wilson. They were like, they wanted war after the sinking of Lusitania, and sometimes even earlier. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt and others were like in 1914 were gearing up for a war. They didn't need Lusitania to even have that. And his campaign message, as everybody knows, in 1916 as he won, he kept us out of the war. And then, of course, a few months later, he got us into the war. But that's not necessarily, maybe saying not necessarily his fault is a little going too far. Of course, it is his fault. But you have to look at the circumstances that happened. After he won the election, Germany's like, okay, hey, we're going to start unrestricted submarine warfare and sink a lot of your ships. And we already know that it's been politically problematic for you, that there's been hundreds of Americans we've killed in submarine warfare. So a lot of them by accident. But now we're going to intentionally sink many American ships. And just don't go to war against us. And of course, his hand was forced is that saying that Germany's aggression against us. I mean, you can't really say that like Wilson. I mean, we had to have commercial trading at that time if we're going to survive as a nation. So you really can't say that like, oh, we shouldn't have been shipping at all, or we should have just ignored the hundreds of Americans like killed by submarine warfare, which Germany wasn't taking as seriously at the time. Also, Germany was making overtures to Mexico in order to get them to start aggression against us. And his hand was forced. And then at the Treaty of Versailles, he was the only person who was like, we should not punish Germany. And everyone's like, yes, we want to carve up the territory. We want them to pay all these indemnities. We want to hurt Germany. He's like, no. Let's not hurt Germany, because this is going to lead us to another war, which he was correct. And that the harder you punish Germany, the more likely it's going to be subverted by Bolshevism. Which, Germany had very serious revolutionary concerns at the time. It was remarkable that they didn't become a communist state. And certainly several territories of Germany were taken over by communists, albeit briefly, following the war. So a lot of his foreign policy, I mean, a lot of people on the distant right imagine him as a neocon because of his moral idealism and that we need to make the world safe for democracy. Yeah, when it comes to World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, when it comes to treating Germany, he was far better than the Republicans and certainly the rest of the Allies.
Of course. And another thing that we typically leave out of Wilson's vision of a post-war Europe is that he actually did believe in sort of micro-nationalism. That is to say, nationalism for all of these smaller countries that were a part of larger empires, which we know
is like Poland,
Poland, Czechoslovakia. Of course, like he kind of messed up with the whole Yugoslavia thing, but fundamentally,
and Czechoslovakia.
But I mean, there was a general push to have these countries become self-determining countries, and while the ultimate resolution of their borders leaves something for most parties, wanting, he didn't see that as he thought that everyone was giving something for the Treaty of Versailles and the post-war world, right? I've read this. There's a number of books that I'll recommend here, but one is a biography of a very right-wing historian and ideologue for Action Française, right? Jacques Bainville. And he, of course, was the force on the other side of Georges Clemenceau, he was saying that, no.
To explain this to listeners who might not understand, is Clemenceau was the French prime minister who was negotiating for the French side at Versailles, and Action Française, as I'm butchering it, was a right-wing group that was, some have called it a proto-fascist group. They weren't really fascist. They were a hardcore monarchists who believed in a integral nationalism. There were some elements of them, and probably a lot of listeners would be interested in reading them. But as a minor digression, continue.
Of course. So you had forces in France that were like, no, we have to carve up Germany, right? We have to divide Germany into separate states so that they will they won't be able to project power across Europe, right? And ultimately, Wilson saw this as an idiotic idea, like an overly chauvinistic idea that would have pushed most of Germans into the camp of Bolshevism. So, like, the restraint of Wilson at that time probably prevented a division of Germany. And if we look at the UK after the result of 1916, even though Ireland wasn't a part of the Versailles Treaty, you'll see that the core home islands of the UK lost more territory as a proportion of that polity than Germany did, right? But the post-war world was just going. The fact is that Wilson created a situation where the U.S. would be acting in Europe as a major power, but it wouldn't be this type of domineering, overarching thing that we've gotten since, after 45 and especially after 1991. He saw.
It was a mediator role. It was like saying, look, like, you guys hate each other so much, we need to jump in and like help you guys work through these issues. And it was not, and it was definitely not that we were the great power coming in to bully them into committing to our will and this neoliberal world order. It was accepting the old world order, but saying like, hey, we would like to help you guys work through your issues.
Of course, and the difference also is a difference in liberalisms, the sort of evolution from 19th century liberalism to mid 20th century liberalism, and then from there, like the sort of slope that we've slipped down is that. Wilson, of course, was an Anglo-American chauvinist. He was he thought that was the pinnacle of civilization. And he did think about the West in terms of white civilization, and that it was up to America to have this sort of moral mediating role in Europe. But it wasn't, let's put all of these parties into Europe that are going to be direct puppets to America. There's a lot of there's sort of the sensation of Americanism in Eastern Europe. There was a lot of places. There's like a Wilson Plaza in Poland, and the main train station in Prague was called like Woodrow Wilson train station and everything like that. So there was like a sort of enthusiasm that America joined in on the side of these recent republics, but it wasn't going to be to the extent that we've seen America use the State Department and NGOs to set up, basically puppet governments in Western Europe and try to get Eastern Europe to do things that socially don't agree with the majority of the population's wishes, right? Like, that was kind of flying in the face of the original goal of Wilsonianism, which was national determination, self-determination.
Yeah, it was, the right to self-determination is something that we would have not too much largely not disagreements with that, and that's much better than today, where we don't want these countries like Hungary and Poland to have any self-determination. They're like, it's like, you can't restrict migrants, you didn't ask us to do that. It's like, you have to have gay pride parade, you can't restrict gay pride parades. Like, that goes against what we've ordered. That's against human rights. There was not also this overarching imposition of human rights, even though Wilson had these things that like everyone should have democracy and stuff, but it wasn't at the same level as modern human rights dogma, even though you could say that it's rooted in what Wilson wanted through his 14 points and what he articulated at the Treaty of Versailles. It is something very different from today, where it's like a State Department official like calling up the authorities in Poland and demanding that they host a gay pride parade.
Of course.
It's not something that it was not something that was going to interfere with, as you were saying, their local social society and customs. It was something that was just going to say, well, you now have democracy now, and you can elect your leaders, and you're not going to be ruled by some empire that you don't recognize as recognizing your own ethnic determination and your own people's way of life. This is something you're going to be able to rule yourself, which, European powers were still in the great powers mode at that time. That didn't sit well with everyone at the table, but they were really carving up the losers, so most of them didn't care.
Of course, and I think this is a good transition point to get to Wilson, the domestic politician, as well, because he had a similar idea of what that meant in America as well. And I should say I kind of divide Wilson's life into three distinct periods. Wilson, the academic, right, as he was writing his histories and his treatises on government power, and sort of articulating the philosophy of what he would want the new state to be. And then, of course, he had 3 strokes before he became president. That should be something that we keep in mind.
Yeah.
And then I divide the next period into Wilson, 1914 to roughly, you could say like roughly the Paris Peace Conference, but really, there was clear signs that something was going on neurologically even before then, like the stress of the war. Because it got his medical condition got aggravated in stressful periods of time. And he sort of got increasingly narrow, even though he could still think about things. And then, of course, the post-stroke Wilson, where he's still president, but he's lost the capacity to even write or go very many places without extensive coaching. But for the most part, Wilson took this idea domestically. He was a progressive, so he was personally for women's suffrage, right? And he was personally for a few different things socially, but fundamentally the political reality of the time and his own feelings about it. He thought that the state, and he writes this in Congressional Government and the book that's called The State, that there's certain technologies that the state is going to have that revolutionize government, right? So you're going to have roads that are going to make travel across the country possible in 2 days. You're going to have, telecommunications lines and all sorts of things that will necessarily expand the role of the state if they're going to regulate these systems, right? So there's all these new technologies that make certain aspects of state government superfluous or harmful, right? He says he articulates this as well in his histories of the United States, where he's talking about how localism was much easier to do when it takes 4 days to cross state lines, right? And this sort of local autonomy. That said, when it came to social issues, he thought that generally, like a state society should reflect the values of its citizenry. And while he hoped that the citizenry would eventually conform to his Southern liberal values, he didn't push things, right? And he certainly had a limited amount of patience for, W.E.B. Du Bois and those types of activists that would come up to him and basically just scream at him for not doing the right thing in like the black community. When if you read his it's the third volume of American Epoch series, and it talks about division and reconciliation, the Jacksonian era, to roughly around 1889, I believe. And if you look at what he's saying about Reconstruction and all of that, the greatest crime of Reconstruction, he thought, was that you put all of these people into Southern governments after the Civil War. You forbid the educated white population from voting because they had served under the Confederacy. And then you put all of these black legislators into the state legislature, and they were former slaves, right? And they don't really have any education, and they can't sign bills. They can't even read the bills. And they're just basically used as a pawn, as pawns for carpetbagger Northerners who use the Freedmen's Bureau as a separate way of maintaining like a patronage network that's enforced through military occupation, right? So he thought that eventually, like the Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey style. Well, he didn't really talk too much about Marcus Garvey, but the Booker T. Washington vision of really black Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? He imagined a world where they would be, liberals. They would be Southern liberals with the sort of ingrained feelings and religious beliefs and social beliefs as the white population. And he believed, that eugenics and education could be sort of the way to push things in that direction, right? But in terms of like forcing the issues of civil like liberties or rights, or however we phrase this for modernity, he didn't believe that that these things, like he thought that these things would take time and that they would take considerable effort, and that fundamentally you couldn't just overthrow the entire system and impose things with military and hard power across the United States, which is, frankly, what's happened since the 1960s. Like that you need this sort of negative exterior force to make the social outcomes that you want to happen possible. So anyway,
yeah, and that's what conservatives really do hate him for the way he had for the government, but they are also using his now racism as one of the big ways. Is that a lot of the people who were 15 years ago, they would just complain about him expanding the size of government. Now they're just complaining about his racism. And as you're pointing out, his notions on race were pretty politically incorrect. I have a few quotes here. Where he says things would be, some people would call them based today. On immigration, he said, quote, "We cannot make a homogenous population out of people who do not blend with a Caucasian race. Oriental coolieism will give us another race problem to solve, and surely we have had our lesson." That was his opinion on immigration. And he was considered a centrist on immigration. He vetoed the literacy test on immigration that was proposed by people like Henry Cabot and others, who we'll talk about in a moment. He also said that America was founded by the, quote, "sturdy stocks of the north of Europe," unquote. How do these opinions comport with his liberal idealism? You were talking about that a little bit, that he imagined that all these people kind of coming together and becoming, assimilating into him, essentially into his brand of politics. And so how does this all, comport together with his liberal idealism?
Well, I think that it comports fairly well to the sort. I mean, it's almost an anathema for us to have this type of confidence in our worldview, right? We've become very soaked in cynicism and irony and that sort of thing. So it's hard for us to even really imagine having this much faith in, your worldview, that like people will convert to your worldview. And, Wilson was, throughout his life, still a very religious man who looked up to his Presbyterian preacher father. And, originally, he was being educated to become a preacher, and this was before Presbyterianism became kind of a shell of what it is now. I mean, frankly, so in his own global way, he thought that the demonstrated superiority of the civilization will make itself like. I mean, it was just material. I mean, it was materially and morally evident that if you wanted to be a superior civilization, you would eventually come around to this American civilization as he's envisioned it, right? And that people have to have their own national self-determination, but that ultimately Wilson had faith that the civilization itself was a stable and morally beneficial thing to have. I mean, it was the sort of America that existed in 1900 was it was just clearly superior to Oriental civilization, or what had the Reconstruction South represented. And so, like, he had this. I mean, he did have a messianic bend to this was the final frontier of civilization, and that has been appropriated across the generations. It's been sort of reused for presidents and speeches and platitudes that increasingly ring hollow to us as we see China's rapid industrialization. But fundamentally, he thought that the assimilation and nationalization were the path to go. He thought that in order to redeem the South entirely, you had to have a national American people, right? Like, so rejoining the American people was a clear thing, like defining American civilization as basically a white liberal civilization. What was another way of doing that. And you see also during the wartime, German Americans had been on the sort of periphery of American life, and in terms of allowing these local languages to, allowing German to continue to be taught and spoken, and the sort of war panic and scare really killed off a lot of the institutions that kept German as a major language spoken in the United States. And there's a similar thing that happened as he was a child that happened with the Creoles, the French-speaking aristocracy that ranged from St. Louis to New Orleans that I talk about a few times. I mean, a bunch of times on my Twitter feed. But that was his ultimate vision. Is this? It was a white America. It was a America that was singular. It was an Anglo-Saxon thing, and it was liberal as well. So, but those terms have kind of moved or have been disappeared as time has gone on.
Yeah, and the culture that he was a part of is no longer there. He was a part of this. I mean, he was a very devout Presbyterian. His university, I mean, Princeton was a devout Presbyterian university at one point, which is crazy to think, even when he was a professor there. The president was horrified that they would appoint a Unitarian professor to the field. And this is just such an outlandish idea today, seeing what our Princeton is, and all these other schools that were once founded as Protestant bastions are now completely secular and removing any traces of the old America from their being, whether it's renaming buildings or, in Harvard's case, taking out mentions of Puritans in their songs. They're not the institutions they once were. That this old WASP America is no longer in control of that, even though a lot of the media still like to pretend that the WASP are running Harvard, Princeton, and everything like that. They're not. It's not the case anymore. This is not the institutions that Woodrow Wilson was a part of, even though they draped themselves in some of the same traditions and dignity that was associated with these grand institutions. They're not the same that they once were. And some people would always say that, like, oh, well, this shows that the roots of America's decline is in Protestantism. It's in dissenting Protestantism. And it's like, well, they had very different ideas about this. This isn't necessarily the Protestants at work. This isn't the end goal of Reformation or anything like that. This was, a different elite came into power throughout the 20th century that was not devout Presbyterians or Methodists or Episcopalians. Some of them were Episcopalians, but it was really the people who had immigrated in from Ellis Island, Jews, Catholics, everybody else who had these grudges against the WASP for, like, we came to your country and you didn't let us into our country clubs. Now we're in charge and we're going to take away all the traces of your past civilization, even though we'll retain the image of being WASP when we go to, Harvard. We'll wear Brooks Brothers and everything like that, and we'll go into and we'll embrace and take over institutions. But it's something very different than it was in Woodrow Wilson's day. And a lot of people on the right like to see, the roots of American decline in the beginning through the Puritans and other dissenting Protestants. I don't really think that's the case. I think it's that, the America becoming a superpower, and also the fact that we took in so many immigrants in the post-Reconstruction era. And even though we limited them in 24 and assimilated a lot of them, that after, World War II and in competition with the Soviet Union, we decided to turn Americanism into this ideology that compete with communism. And thus that made America more cringe and and that we now have to welcome everybody in. And there were some traces, of the past roots in, Protestantism with, like, the shining city on the hill and that type of rhetoric. But it was ultimately something very different that had been invented out of convenience in the wake of the Cold War.
Of course. And I mean, there's always a historical argument to say, well, at what point does America truly decline, or when did its elite shift from having a positive idea of what America was to either a fundamentally cynical one or one that's, being used to enrich certain cliques? And certainly this was at least somewhat true in Wilson's day as well. I mean, although it's not like it was already sort of unilateral. For example, the House of Morgan, of course, was very eager to get America to go into the war, and I mean, they were financing the sort of rhetoric that you saw by the Republicans to join in the war immediately. And with some of the other financial donor classes, you already see sort of the influence of men like Jacob Schiff and the Warburgs. Even on Wilson's side, there was a abrogation of the Russo-American Treaty of 1834. You won't find an article on that one, by the way. Like, there's no Wikipedia article on that. What happened was essentially you had these East European lobbying groups, primarily Jewish, although there were some Polish as well, that lobbied for basically the change of status between diplomatic status between the U.S. and Russia, and you had like a hostility by some of these Wall Street people to joining the war on the Entente side because it would be supporting the Tsar, right? Because you'd be saving Russian autocracy and the grudges that were left over from the reasons they immigrated, pogroms, and the general situation inside the Pale of settlement inside of Russia. You had an immense hostility to that, which is why it's very important to, I'll be talking a lot about I've talked a lot already about the Russian Revolution on my Twitter feed and on Sallow Forum, but there was a significant coincidence of timing between the February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar, and of course the reception of the Zimmerman Telegraph by Woodrow Wilson, and the sort of lead up to America's entry into the war. So it'd be remiss of me not to say, well, these things weren't at least somewhat of a factor in international relations of the United States, and should they have been? Probably not. I mean, definitely not. I think, but that was kind of. That was still like mostly on the outside influencing in rather than the set clique of power at that stage. There was still a core of primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestant statesmen. And we can debate, of course, whether the actual structure of the American system was designed in such a way that it couldn't fight back against this influence. Certainly, Wilson himself had some major reservations about the American system as it existed in his 1880s book, Congressional Government, which he argues that you've basically got a super constitutional government that has completely changed the dynamics of the power structure with senatorial committees and the rule and the role of the judiciary. He said that that's the only way to move past that was to create a parliamentary system where there would be an American prime minister who would be able to officiate as an executive more directly over the basically disparate and random influences of the congressional system and the committee system inside of Congress. So in a way, he was looking to American futurism as much as some of us might be looking towards an American futurism. And ultimately, when we talk about his fights with Henry Cabot Lodge, we'll see that, in a way, he proved his own summation about the American political system correct, because when it actually came to defining an American place in the world, it became like this partisan infighting issue that like immediately killed like the real prospects for what he envisioned that role to be. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, and there is, and you're touching on to this about his critiques of the American system, and a lot of conservatives like to call Wilson a liberal fascist because he saw an organic unity to the nation that bound it to the state. He believed in an organic state and that there was a living constitution. And conservatives prefer to see, well, at least Conservative Inc. prefers to see America as a bunch of individuals who happen to live in the same country and they are horrified by notions of an organic state. What do you make of Wilson's view of the state in our Constitution? You were already hinting at that a little bit by saying that his idea of American futurism, and it's somewhat similar to what the dissident right imagines.
Yes, and I had hoped to get to this point because to Wilson's own prescriptions, he envisioned, it was a sort of synthesis of his historical thinking and his own experiences, along with his observations on the inertia of congressional government, he graduated. He got his doctorate actually from Johns Hopkins, which was somewhat of a school for technocrats, right, at the time. I mean, It was being made to sort of create a new role of like technocratic leadership that would like be focused on the administration of these new technologies. But his ultimate view was that state government, for the obstructionist side of things, like the state government's own individual sovereignty when it came to issues of infrastructure or communications and these types of issues were effectively defunct, right? I mean, he was like, they've been completely obliterated by the Civil War. You're not going to go back to these things. And something that Con Inc. tries to do over and over again is, try to pump, image into states' rights, even though we've seen again and again through the Supreme Court that they've been just slapped down every time they even try to maintain a status quo inside of a certain state. So he was already saying that, no, this isn't going to work. You can't, have this industrialized country and then expect, these state governments to be able to compete with the federal center. And, part of his, his officially stated motif of segregating the federal bureaucracy was that it would be more efficient that way. That to have certain roles be filled. He wanted ultimately to rise the black population into a capacity to administrate. But he fundamentally said that no, the federal government has to be streamlined and made efficient to deal with like these social issues, to deal with the labor strikes and the labor problem. And he was the initiator of viewing the country in this way, like that the federal government should be looking out for the national interest of all Americans, and like that Americans as a nationality have like have this path historically where they all become a singular American people.
Yeah, and though that view was shared by his
in those parts of it, it needed an No, you go.
A little bit of error there. Okay, but two of his chief adversaries also shared that idea, but they hated Wilson. And I'm, of course, talking about the ardent nationalists of Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. I think a lot of the people in the dissident right would see a lot of things that they share in common with both Roosevelt and Lodge, and they vehemently hated Wilson. I believe Lodge said that he couldn't believe he could hate somebody so much in politics as Wilson. And what do you make of their differences in between each other? I mean, they both saw America as an Anglo-Saxon country. They both saw that the government should be serving the people. Lodge less so than Roosevelt, but they were ultimately on the same page. In the general sphere, they weren't necessarily states' rights Republicans or conservatarians who were like, not my big government. That this is government tyranny. They weren't. It wasn't those reasons that they hated Wilson. What were the main differences between Lodge and Roosevelt and Wilson?
So part of it does come down, to personality, right? I mean, so Henry Cabot Lodge actually published. He was overseeing with publishing congressional government when Wilson was a collegiate student, and he didn't like it, and he wrote a review as much. So there's been Wilson was very bad at handling people that would ultimately disagree with him. He broke several times over the course of his presidency with subordinates who became too intransigent, and then he didn't handle that insubordination very well, or the slight to his character very well. He
held a lot of long-term grudges. His best friend at Princeton University voted against him when he was president, and he refused to ever to talk to him ever again. Even at one time when he was president, and this is 10 years ago, the friend approached him thinking that he wanted to meet, and he's like, "Sorry, I don't want to shake your hand." So he did have. He's very much a person who didn't forgive slights.
Yes, I mean, he did that with William Jennings Bryan. He did that with his main diplomats and his missions. I mean, Colonel House, he eventually broke with Colonel House and really never spoke with him again because he thought that he had overstepped his boundaries in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. So a part of it does come down to, the inevitability that men like Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt have to campaign against each other. And then, when there's this overbreach in etiquette, they don't do any sort of rapprochement, and these grudges sort of build and build over the years, right? So there's no real reason to deny, Teddy Roosevelt his unit in World War I, but I mean, because he had slighted Wilson years back, it was not going to happen, right? But then there was also more substantive reasons. You had different financial backers for the parties. It wasn't so uniform as it was today. With the Morgans running a lot of Republican financing, you had this sort of push to get America into the war, which Wilson obviously abhorred that vision of entering the war because it was realistically geopolitically beneficial for America to do so, and that they could get concrete territorial interests satisfied or financial interests satisfied by entering into the war on this side or the other. So the traditional way of looking at things would be Theodore Roosevelt was an American imperialist, and he had these ideas about Anglo-Saxon America and everything like that. But he was an international realist, right? And that he used the power of the American state, or he wanted to use the power of the American state to occupy the role as a traditional great power on the European model, versus Wilson, who had a more moralistic role of an idealistic role of what America should do in the new world, right? That is going to be created from this huge catastrophe. And to a certain extent, that holds true. But fundamentally, though, I mean, it does come down to what particular coalitions made up their respective governments. And even though that there was little differences in substantive vision overall of what America should be, I think that what happened to the Republicans is they sort of backed themselves into a corner over the Versailles treaty ratification conflict. I mean, afterwards they were kind of memed into the conservatarian type of ideology since they campaigned against the ratification of the Versailles Treaty. Is like it's going to be this global government, and it's going to like come and disrupt everything about your lives. And so like right-wing talking points from a conservatarian viewpoint, despite moving in a similar direction at the start of the century as the Democrats, ultimately diverged. I feel primarily because of this fight that happened over Wilson's legacy and these sort of changes that the Senate wanted to add to the Versailles Treaty and weren't successful in getting.
Yeah, and there was this concern that it was going to put a one world government. And the funny thing about Lodge is that his grandson, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and also I think some listeners are like, who the hell is Henry Cabot Lodge? We keep talking about it. Henry Cabot Lodge is a Republican senator from Massachusetts who was one of the most powerful Republicans in the Senate for all this time. And he was Mr. WASP, Mr. Anglo. He was also a devoted immigration restrictionist and was championing many of the restrictions that later went into law. I think he died before. He died the same year of the 24 Act. I'm not sure I think he may have died before voting on it, but of course, the 24 Act was ultimately something he supported. And just to give a little brief is like who people are like wondering who Henry Cabot Lodge is. The funny thing is that his grandson, who shared the same name, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., they skipped over a generation. I don't know how that works, but that's another topic, was an enthusiastic advocate of the United Nations. He's like, oh, well, this is actually what the League of Nations should have been like. And it's like, I think the United Nations is like worse than global government. And also Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. was a firm advocate of building the current American empire we have, which is very different from the type of American empire that Teddy Roosevelt wanted, which was going to be similar to the great powers. This empire is for our interests as a people, and we're doing what every other powerful nation should do, while the post World War II empire is we're spreading liberalism and human rights and equality to all the world, and we're not doing this for our own benefit, which has made us do many in Iraq and elsewhere. That's the type of empire that Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. was doing. And that is to show the kind of decline of the West, or WASP rather, from their grandparents' generation of the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, where they became, without a better term to use, they became fully cucked, and they were the most ardent advocates of the Cold War empire that was exporting Americanism around the world, while in the early 20th century, they were imagined themselves as a great power that was standing up for a white Anglo-Saxon man. And that was gone by the 1950s. And, going to the contemporary level, with Wilson being canceled, with conservatives and the dissident right pretty much hating him, where does Wilson stand in the current political dynamic? Where do you think what example do you think he sets for today? Who do you think are his modern heirs? Where does he stand in today's current political climate?
Well, that's a difficult question because so much of who made Wilson's coalition, even as an electoral system, they're kind of, that world, is gone, right? The world where you could have agrarian Southern populists vote with the European immigrants of major cities, and they would be mostly on the same page. That world, or that electoral coalition has been greatly reduced in its significance, especially since the sort of pathway of developing like a liberal idealism and sort of world government have greatly gone away from the sort of limits that the Wilsonian era have set themselves in. So, it's kind of reformulated underneath, a new electoral coalition. At least the grandchildren of the yeomen and the grandchildren of the urban workers who have now mostly been blown out of the cities, and now they live in suburbs and whatnot. But his modern heirs would be difficult to pinpoint because up until recently, of course, it was the neoliberals and like neocons that really believed in this vision or at least used the image that they created of Woodrow Wilson to justify their own experiments in globalization and everything like that. Now that project's broken down, who does Wilson belong to? And I think that's a difficult question to answer because of how much the country has changed. Fundamentally, though, when you ask that question, Woodrow Wilson was an American politician from the early 20th century, and he belongs to the Americans who were there at the beginning of the 20th century. So if there's lessons to be learned from Wilson's example, it's that if we do engage in political action, make sure that you've checked his medical history and he hasn't had 3 strokes before he became president. But also, make sure that the people that surround you are going to be ones that are capable of meeting that vision of what you've set, and that won't be either wholeheartedly rejected or turned into something fundamentally corrupted once you've set that in place. Of course, that's a very hard task, and we'll have to see if there's any way to achieve that. But fundamentally, though, Wilson, just like Teddy Roosevelt, is American, and that's what you should think of him as.
Yes, and he is a fundamentally American personality and as you were exactly, he was a man of his time, and I think people should be less overtly hostile. Whenever I say like something about Wilson, they're like, he was the worst president ever, and a lot of it is their latent libertarianism coming out, because libertarians, of course, hate him, and a lot of their historiography comes from particularly in the dissident right, comes from libertarians, and they really haven't gotten over it. They're like, he created the Federal Reserve, we have to end the Fed. And it's like, okay, well, maybe the Fed is not the best thing in the world, but there are a lot of other bigger problems that we have to face, and auditing the Fed is not really a major political priority. And at the time, like, the Federal Reserve was a better idea maybe than it is today, but it's definitely a lot of latent libertarianism that a lot of reasons why people hate. The other is that some people who are Americans imagine that they share the same national history as Germany, and are very upset that he didn't fight with Imperial Germany, even though they didn't really have any reason to fight on the side of Imperial Germany. I'm not sure why 21st century Americans particularly care about or see themselves in Imperial Germany. It's not that saying that it was an evil government or anything like that, or it didn't have positive aspects. I'm just saying that Imperial Germany is not our heritage, and the war neither side in the war was was right, and the real correct side was ending it as quickly as possible. And American entry, whatever its negative consequences did in the war, maybe they would have sought a peace in 1917, but we don't really know. They could have just been fighting for many years, and they could have all been overtaken by Bolshevism. We don't really know. So in that case, I think some people just need a little less hostile interpretation of Wilson. Look at read his academic works, which are much more based than you would see in modern history. And I think his interpretations and the imagine of what he's thought of as state is something similar to what we imagine. But, moving on to a different topic and to a country that's not canceling its history, but actually building really cool national cathedrals to it. Russia recently completed its epic national military cathedral, which looks like a wonder you would build in an early 2000s real-time strategy game. It intends to celebrate and honor Russia's history and heritage. It serves as a stark contrast to America's unending iconoclasm and contempt for its heritage. Now, Eric, you're a major expert on Russia and Eastern Europe. So what are your thoughts on the cathedral? What does this show in modern Russian identity and Russia's current cultural moment right now?
So that's a very good question, and it does highlight the differences between current American and Russian attitudes to these things. Not only this, this really just amazing national cathedral. There's a few minor documentaries on it on YouTube that I would recommend everyone listening to this watch. But there's also they've also been building major World War II memorials leading up to the anniversaries or the major 5-year anniversaries of the conflict. There's also a fantastic looking new monument at Rzhov, which was a horrible battle not that far away from Moscow. And it has a soldier, and he's sort of dissolving into cranes in the lower part of the statue. It's a massive statue, and it goes to show the differences in attitude of what World War II has come to mean in both countries. If you go to a Victory Day celebration in modern Russia, you're going to see people walking down the street with photos of their, grandfathers and fathers. The church bells are going to be ringing, and it's going to be this massive display of filial piety, right? Whereas you log on to Twitter any day of the week, and you, the Anglo-American or more recent addition to American Ellis Islander, you are going to be called the Nazi, the real Nazi.
The funny thing is that we see in a modern World War II discourse, because this dominates all American political talk, is that we now see Antifa as the equivalent to the soldiers who stormed Normandy. And what we were really fighting for was a kind of communism, even though some people don't really like to use the term cultural Marxism. In this case, it's kind of typical because it's useful because in the modern discourse, what we fought for in World War II was 21st century leftism, that we were fighting for trans rights. We were fighting for, reparations and Black Lives Matter and mass immigration and everything that associated with leftism today. That's what the boys at Normandy and Battle of the Bulge were fighting for. And it's not a nationalist struggle at all. They're starting to strip any type of patriotic fervor that we were just fighting for. We were fighting against immigration restriction and traditional marriage or anything that was traditional. They turn the Nazis into everything that they don't like today, and they just say they stood for this, and our soldiers were fighting for equality, and they were essentially Antifa. While in the Soviet Union, they were ostensibly fighting for communism. It's now just turned into a great national struggle, which they of course use Soviet Union flags and the Red Star and everything of that sort. It's a national it's a day of embracing their national identity as Russians and just saying like and it connects them to their ancestors. They're so proud of their grandfather and great uncle who fought and possibly died at the front. And this is our great struggle as a nation where we fought and survived. And this makes Russia strong, which, nobody, they never say that it's something like America was made stronger or the nation, the American nation was made stronger. It's just that our ideals were stronger, that our belief in freedom was stronger, that this was our secret ingredient. While in Russia, it's like, no, us as a people, us as a nation is what won the war. And this is why we have this, we imagine, this great patriotic war. While in America, it's like the great unpatriotic war, as it's turning out, because any display of nationalism puts you on the side of Nazis. If you're waving an American flag, somehow you were on the opposite side of Normandy Beach.
Yes, as we all know, General Douglas MacArthur says trans rights.
Yes, absolutely. So there is this different conception of how World War II is treated, and in particular with, Russia is, having to create a historical identity for itself. It's much more complex when you've lived under multiple governments that were overthrown, of creating a coherent national narrative and identity, but they do connect themselves with the exploits and glories of the Soviet Union, and they're very proud of that. And there's also this growing, regrowing Stalin cult, which is funny. Whenever there's like a dedication to Stalin, some people will try to protest and they beat him up, which I don't know. I'm not necessarily approving revering Stalin necessarily, but in Russia, to many people, he's a national hero, while in our country, we can't even revere Woodrow Wilson,
right,
or now even to Abraham Lincoln, just because of what they said and wrote about blacks.
Yeah.
For that reason alone, we can't. While in Russia, they're like, well, it's okay. Stalin may have killed millions of people and my grandparents, but I think he's a hero anyway. There's a completely different way of interpreting their history and reacting to it.
Yeah, this might be another conversation for another day, but you can see the difference in Soviet cinema for things like Come and See, or the Cranes Are Flying, or Ivan's Childhood. All of which, the last two I believe are on YouTube with subtitles in English too. But they always have that scene. Like it's the lieutenant in the burned, destroyed Reichschancellery, right? Or it's the Waffen-SS guy talking about
Incumbency, yeah.
Yeah, like Incumbency.
And for listeners who might not know, these movies are World War II movies. Come and See is considered by many to be one of the best World War II movies. And the Patriots scene where the Dragoons burn down a church with everyone locked inside is a scene ripped straight from Come and See, and it makes no sense in the Revolutionary era, but it made sense in World War II. But that digression. But yeah, continue with where they have a lieutenant who's explaining the German cause. Right,
and he's explaining that it's a specific racial struggle and that they're all like Untermenschen, right? And they all deserve to die. And then like the partisans just shoot everyone. And they leave them there, and that's kind of, they bury that, right? They bury the war is buried there, right? In 1946, in a Hollywood movie I love talking about, it's called The Stranger, and it stars Orson Welles, right? And it's kind of made into the film noir style that was popular then. And Orson Welles plays a hidden Nazi that survived the war, and they have to figure out that this German professor is actually a Nazi, and they end up killing him, right? But it's like that's kind of the difference in memory there, whereas. Even a lot of German Russo-German relations today are fairly, they're fairly benign. They're fairly good, right? Actually, they have sort of been working with one another on things like the Nord Stream pipelines and really kind of circumventing certain diplomatic restrictions that America has put on Russia. Whereas, like this extension of finding the hidden Nazi or the Nazi that escaped and everything like that has now taken on like a meta-social cultural revolution type of role in American media and politics, right? To the point where it's become the definition of what state politics are. So
that's evident in when they find, there's always a news story where they find like some 96-year-old Ukrainian who was like conscripted into like guarding like a prisoner camp, and they like gave him an SS uniform, and there's not even any clear if he did commit war crimes or not, but they're like, this is a Nazi and we have to kill him. And anytime this guy's like clearly on like death's door and he's like being wheeled up in a wheelchair and he's like sick and he's clearly not a threat to anyone, and they strip him of his pension and any rights, and then they try to deport him, and they're like, this is a great victory. And the Trump administration always highlights how they deported some Slav who got conscripted into some like at the end of the war, some SS like police battalion or something like that, and they're like, we kicked out this Nazi and this is a great victory for us. I'm like, you know, whatever bad things this guy did in his life, he's like an old man who's like on the point of death, and like you deporting him is like doesn't make us our country safer. Like you're letting MS-13 members stay in our country and other real threats while you're like turning it into like a great political victory that you deported some 95-year-old invalid.
Right. And of course, the ultimate irony is that, you know, the CIA actually did recruit a lot of these.
Exactly. Yeah. We recruited them.
Oh, wait.
Yeah. We were funding. We were funding neo-fascist terror groups in Western Europe in case like the Soviet Union, our communists took over, and we were encouraging fascist terror in 1970s Italy. And now we're like, oh, this is terrible. And they're not really persecuting. I mean, well, we did persecute a lot of people, prosecute a lot of people that like either us or our allies have been using in the 70s and 80s. We were decided, well, we're done with them, that you can now have them, Israel or Poland or who else wanted to press charges against them, that we gave up on a lot of these guys. But there is this, you know, this desire to have these demons, these devils that we see as the ultimate evil, and we must continually purge ourselves of them, carries on to where we're now just going after 95-year-old guards who were not in the planning. They probably really didn't know what the hell they were signing up for. They weren't even German. I don't think any of the people that we've brought on charges or deported have been German. They've all been like Ukrainians or some other Eastern European group that were just conscripted into what it is. But we need this great evil in our country, and it's something that that's even ramping up further due to Trump and fears of the alt-right. And this is the type of cultural climate we have. But yes, we can talk about that much, much more. Of course, we're running. We've of course been out of time. It was a excellent discussion. We'll have to have you on again to talk about numerous other topics. But how can people find you, Irk?
Okay, well, they can always find me at Twitter at Irkutyanin1, or they could.
You might want to spell that out for the listeners.
Oh, okay. IRKUTYANIN1, or they could look up that name on Sallow Forum and read some of the book reviews or other things that I've posted there.
Yeah, and I have to highly recommend his Twitter. You'll get a ton of good book recommendations. This guy has read a plethora of books, and he's always recommending great books that you should see. And he's always also posting a lot of book excerpts for interesting topics and a lot of information. So highly recommend following him. And thanks for coming on again.
Yes, thanks for having me on, Scott. It was great.
It was terrific. You're exactly right. And until next time, stay respected.